The U.S. military covered up the missile's nuclear status when it announced a plan to deploy it and began to build bases. But among the employees hired locally for no nukes allowed in Okinawa. Lawmakers of the government of the former Ryukyu Islands, known as Okinawa today, called for the Japanese government's cooperation in canceling the deployment. How were the appeals from Okinawans received in Tokyo? We found a record of a meeting between then Japanese Foreign Minister Zentaro Kosaka and U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk. What was worrying Kosaka turned out to be the public backlash in Okinawa.
Every entry of the mace or similar weapons into Okinawa sparks controversies when announced in advance. Can you not make such prior notice?
The U.S. side countered.
Our procedure calls for certain announcements to be made in advance. If the revelation comes after the fact, controversy is less likely because people feel it's too late to say anything. Advance notice would result in the Japanese government being accused of not blocking the move.
Saneyoshi Furugen was a legislator of the government of the Ryukyu Islands, which was seeking cancellation of the Mace-B deployment. He has just learned how Tokyo was dealing with the situation at that time. In 1962, 4 Mace-B launch sites were completed in the face of local opposition. The U.S. was now ready to attack its enemies with nuclear missiles launched from Okinawa. We now know that Okinawa was being pushed to the verge of a nuclear war as the U.S. continued to reinforce it as a nuclear stronghold.
That a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
The Cuban Missile Crisis broke out in 1962. The Soviet Union was found to have brought nuclear missiles into Cuba, just a few hundred kilometers off the U.S. coast. The standoff between the two superpowers grew volatile. Fears of nuclear war spread. Tension engulfed the Mace-B launch sites in Okinawa. Robert O'Hannison was on duty at one of the sites at that time. He is 74 years old now.
Amazing. Oh, so different.
He visited the site for the first time in half a century.
This was a place of war, and now I see it as a place of peace. Just very moving, touching. Like something you expect when you went into a military facility.
This is the first TV footage of the interior.
This here would be the stairway that went up to 2 bays. And then ahead of us here is the Launch Control Center.
O'Hannison says he was on duty in the Launch Control Center at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We've obtained declassified photos of the inside of the room. This is a target designation device. The display reads, "Top secret." Only a handful of soldiers involved in launching missiles knew where the missiles were aimed. O'Hannison was one of them.
Most of our targets were in China. You know, we weren't dealing with anything at that time other than, you know, our concerns with China.
The Soviet Union and China had long been on friendly terms. The U.S. deemed them a collective enemy. Washington was planning to pound China from Okinawa at the same time as launching an attack on the Soviet Union. The nuclear arms in Okinawa could have triggered an all-out war. That was when the U.S. military declared a state of readiness for nuclear war, or DEFCON 2, for the first time in history.
At that point, it became serious, and we put all our missiles into a pre-launch condition. We didn't really do anything. We couldn't go any farther because the next step, you know, from a DEFCON 2 to DEFCON 1 would have, you know, launched our missiles. Emotionally, I think people felt it around the world, but the severity of it, I don't think everybody understood.
The indicators for the Mace B's level of readiness showed hot. They were ready to be fired immediately. Emergency orders were issued to other units in Okinawa.
These are the letters.
Paul Carpenter was on duty at a nuclear ammunition depot in Kadena. He still hangs on to the command letters from that time.
This says there were 3. I remember that there was only one other guy. Top secret, and then Kunsan Airmen.
Carpenter says he transported plutonium to be loaded onto nuclear arms to an Air Force base in South Korea. It seems Okinawa was an emergency supply base for nuclear arms for mainland Japan and South Korea.
Plutonium cores, us, we go to Kunsan, we work on the weapons, the weapons are taken to be put on airplanes. And I was just looking out the window thinking, this is really bad. This is really serious. We're going to maybe have a war.
At the time, Carpenter was living in the U.S. Kadena base with his 3 children and his wife Yoshiko, whom he had met in Okinawa. He reveals the anguish he felt doing his job without the freedom to tell his family of the looming crisis.
Never see him again.
You mean that the world will end?
I didn't really think the world would end, but I thought Okinawa would end. We had our nuclear weapons, but Russians had their nuclear weapons too. And Okinawa was, the whole island was one of the most important American military bases. So they're gonna wipe out Okinawa.
The crisis of a nuclear war was averted at the last minute. But Okinawa at that time was definitely on the verge of annihilation. The nuclear buildup in Okinawa continued even after the Cuban Missile Crisis. The number of nuclear arms there peaked in 1967 at about 1,300. Around that time, calls were mounting in Okinawa for the removal of nuclear arms and for the territory to revert to Japan. Tokyo could no longer ignore them. In 1969, Japanese Prime Minister Eisaku Sato and U.S. President Richard Nixon agreed on the return of Okinawa. The U.S. also promised to remove its nuclear arms from the territory. This footage shows the U.S. military removing Mace B missiles 1 month later. It was a public demonstration of the denuclearization of Okinawa, which had been sought by the locals. As it turned out, however, Sato and Nixon arrived at the so-called secret nuclear deal in exchange for Okinawa's reversion.
In time of great emergency, the United States will require the re-entry of nuclear weapons in Okinawa. The U.S. also requires the standby retention and activation of existing nuclear storage facilities at Kadena, Naha, and Henoko.
We interviewed an official who was closely involved in the secret deal. Melvin Laird was the U.S. Secretary of Defense at that time. He passed away in November 2016 at the age of 94. Just 2 months earlier, Mr. Laird answered our questions over the phone.
Good afternoon.
Yes, hello. Good afternoon, sir. Mr. Melvin Laird.
Yes.
This is what the former Secretary of Defense had to say about the background to the secret nuclear pact.
We both shared mutually in the importance of that agreement. It was part of our protection of Japan because they had no nuclear weapons and were standing there naked. If that wasn't where the Japanese wanted them, they should have put them someplace else.
Right. And also...
They chose Okinawa. That was your government's position. They felt it should not be made public.
"45 years after its reversion to Japanese rule, Okinawa still hosts 70% of the U.S. military installations in Japan. In response to our inquiry, the U.S. Department of Defense said it wouldn't comment on the presence or absence of nuclear arms in Okinawa. In the meantime, Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs has declared the secret nuclear pact currently invalid and maintains its unconditional refusal of nuclear weapons, citing the 3 principles of not possessing, making, or importing them. The Kadena ammunition storage area was home to the bulk of the nuclear arms in Okinawa before its reversion to Japan. Its size is largely unchanged. Okinawa was once turned into an island of nukes by the calculations of Japan and the U.S. The U.S. bases there still survive in the name of deterrence, continuing to place a heavy burden on local communities even today. That reality remains unchanged.